Okay, so I am starting. I must have stopped that last recording in the middle of a sentence or something. I don't know what I was doing. Anyway, so there's this white woman. She was in the anti-racist professional development course, and she's talking about how it was. I really don't like this quote. I've started it 18 times to read it, but the lady, the way she speaks doesn't make sense, so it's really hard to read it. But anyway, here it is. Start quote. What it was like for me when I was taking the course 1 year ago and just afterwards. Hell, because this dissonance stuff doesn't feel all that great. And trying to put it in perspective and figure out what to do with it is very hard. I was on the bandwagon, so I wasn't going to be quiet about it. So there was this dissonance everywhere. Personally, I remember going home for Thanksgiving, the first Thanksgiving while taking the course, back to our families, and turning to my brother-in-law and saying, I really don't want you to say that in front of me. I don't want to hear that joke. I'm not interested. At every turn, it seemed like I was responsible for saying something. My husband, who I think is a very liberal person, but who really hasn't been through this, saying, I think you're taking yourself a little too seriously here, and where's your sense of humor? You have lost your sense of humor. And my saying, it isn't funny, you don't understand, it just isn't funny to me. Not that he would ever tell a racial joke, but there were these things that would come up and he would just sort of look back and say, I don't understand where you're coming from now. So there was a lot of dissonance. I don't think anyone was too comfortable with me for a while. End quote. My college students have similar experiences with family members and friends. Though they want to stop the cycle of racism, the message from the surrounding white community seems to be, get back on! A very poignant example of this was shared with me by a young white man from a very privileged background. He wrote, I realized that it was possible to simply go through life totally oblivious to the entire situation, or even if one realizes it, one can totally repress it. It is easy to fade into the woodwork, run with the rest of society, and never have to deal with these problems. So many people I know at home are just like this. They've simply accepted what society has taught them with little, if any, question. My father is a prime example of this. It has caused much friction in our relationship, and he often tells me as a father he has failed in raising me correctly. Most of my high school friends will never deal with these issues and propagate them on their own children. It's easy to see how the cycle continues. I don't think I could ever justify within myself simply turning my back on the problem. I finally realized that my position in all these dominant groups gives me power to make change occur. It is an unfortunate result often that I feel alienated from friends and family. It's often played off as a mere stage that I'm going through. I obviously can't tell if it's merely a stage, but I know that and they say this to take the attention off the truth of what I'm saying. By belittling me, they take the power out of my argument. It's very depressing, and being passionate and considerate are seen as only phases that people go through. I don't want it to be a phase for me, but as obvious as this may sound, I look at my environment and often wonder how it will not be. End quote. The social pressure from friends and acquaintances to collude, to not notice racism, can be quite powerful. But it is very difficult to stop noticing something once it has been pointed out. The conflict between noticing and not noticing generates internal tension, and there is a great desire to relieve it. Relief often comes through what Helms calls reintegration. At this stage, the previous feelings of guilt or denial may be transformed into fear and anger directed towards people of color. The logic is, if there's a problem with racism, then you people of color must have done something to cause it. And if you would just change your behavior, the problem would go away. The elegance of this argument is that it relieves the white person of all responsibility for social change. I am sometimes asked if it is absolutely necessary to go through this phase. Must one blame the victim? Although it is not inevitable, most white people who speak up against racism will attest to the temptation they sometimes feel to slip back into the collusion and silence. Because the pressure to ignore racism and to accept the socially sanctioned stereotypes is so strong, and the system of advantage so seductive, Many white people get stuck into reintegration thinking. The psychological tension experienced at this stage is clearly expressed by Connie, a white woman of Italian ancestry who took my course on the psychology of racism. After reading about the stages of white identity development, she wrote, "There was a time when I never considered myself a color. I never described myself as white Italian female, until I got to college and noticed that people of color always describe themselves by race and color. While taking this course, I have begun to understand that being white makes a difference. I never thought about it before, but there are many privileges to being white. In my personal life, I cannot say that I have ever felt that I have had the advantage over a black person, but I am aware that my race has the advantage. I am feeling really guilty lately about that. I find myself thinking, I didn't mean to be white. I really didn't mean it. I'm starting to feel angry towards my race for ever using this advantage towards personal gains. But at the same time, I resent the minority groups. I mean, it's not my fault that society has deemed us superior. I don't feel any better than a black person. But it really does matter because I'm a member of a dominant race. I can't help it. And I sometimes get angry and feel like I'm being attacked. I guess my anger towards a minority group would enter me into the next stage of reintegration, where I am once again starting to blame the victim. This is all very trying for me and has been on my mind a lot. I would really like to be able to reach the last stage, where I can accept being white without hostility and anger. That is really hard to do. But I'm an individual. Another source of the discomfort and anger that whites often experience in this phase stems from the frustration of being seen as a group member, rather than an individual. People of color learn early in life that they are seen by others as members of a group. For whites, thinking of oneself as only a member is a legacy of white privilege. As McIntosh writes, I can swear or dress in second-hand clothes or not answer letters without having people attribute these choices to the bad morals, the poverty, or the illiteracy of my race. I can do well in a challenging situation without being called credit to my race, and I am never asked to speak for all the people of my racial group. In short, she and other whites are perceived as individuals most of the time. The view of oneself as an individual is very compatible with the dominant ideology of rugged individualism and the American myth of meritocracy. Understanding racism as a system of advantage that structurally benefits whites and disadvantages people of color on the basis of group membership threatens not only beliefs about society, but also beliefs about one's life accomplishments. For example, organizational consultant Nancy Zane writes that senior white male managers were clearly invested in the notion that their hard work, ingenuity, and skills have won them their senior level positions. As others talked about the systematic, racist, and sexist barriers to their own achievements, white men heard it as a condemnation that they somehow didn't deserve their position. If viewing oneself as a group member threatens one's definition, making the paradigm shift from individual to group member will be painful. In the case of white men, both maleness and whiteness are normative, so acknowledging group status may be particularly difficult. Those white women who have explored their subordinate gender identity have made at least some movement away from the notion of strictly individual self-definition and may find it easier to grasp the significance of their racial group membership. However, as McIntosh and others have pointed out, understanding one form of oppression does not guarantee recognition of another. Those whites who are highly identified with a particular subordinate identity may also struggle with claiming whiteness as a meaningful group category because they feel far from the white male norm. For example, Jewish people of European ancestry sometimes do not think of themselves as white because for them the term means white Christian. Also, in Nazi Germany, Jews were defined as a distinct non-Aryan racial group. In the context of an anti-Jewish culture, salient identity may be the targeted Jewish identity. However, in terms of U.S. racial ideology, Jews of European ancestry are also the beneficiaries of white racial privilege. My white Jewish students often struggle with the tension between being targeted and receiving privilege. In this case, as in others, the reality of multiple identities complicates the process of coming to terms with one's particular dimensions of identity. For example, one student wrote, "I am constantly afraid that people will see my assertion of my Jewish identity as a denial of whiteness, as a way of escaping the acknowledgement of white privilege. I feel I am both part of and not part of whiteness. I am struggling to be more aware of my white privilege, but I will not do so at the cost of having my Jewishness erased." Similarly, white lesbians sometimes find it hard to claim privileged status as whites when they are so targeted by homophobia and heterosection, often at the hands of other whites. These complexities notwithstanding, when white men and women begin to understand that they are viewed as members of a dominant racial group not only by other whites but also by people of color, they are sometimes troubled, even angered, to learn that simply because of their group status, they are viewed with suspicion by many people of color. "I'm an individual. View me as an individual." For example, in a racially mixed group of educators participating in an anti-racist professional development course, a black man commented about using his radar to determine if the group would be a safe place for him. Many of the white people in the room, who believed that their very presence in the chorus was proof of their trustworthiness, were upset by this comment, initially unprepared to acknowledge the invisible legacy of racism that accompanied any and every interaction they had had with people of color. The white people in the course found some comfort in reading Lois Stavely's memoir, The Education of a Wasp, in which she described her own responses to the ways black people tested her trustworthiness. She writes, "I could never resent the tests as some white people have told me they do. But to me, the longest tests have always indicated the deepest hurts. We whites would have to be naive to expect that hundreds of years of humiliation can be forgotten the moment we wish it to be. At times, the most poignant part of the test is that black people have enough trust left to give. Testing implies we might pass the test. It is safer and easier for a black person to turn his back on us. If he does not gamble on our sincerity, he doesn't have to be hurt if he's proved false. Testing shows an optimism I doubt I could duplicate if I were black." Sometimes poorly organized anti-racism workshops or other educational experiences can create a scenario that places participants at risk for getting stuck in their anger. Effectiveness about racism must also point the way toward constructive action. When people don't have the tools for moving forward, they tend to return to what is familiar, often becoming more vigorous in their defense of the racial status quo than they were initially. As we have seen, many white people experience themselves as powerless, even in the face of privilege. But the fact is that we all have a sphere of influence, some domains in which we exercise some level of power and control. The task for each of us, white and of color, is to identify that our own sphere of influence is, however large or small, and to consider how it might be used to interrupt the cycle of racism. Defining a positive white identity. As a white person's understanding of the complexity of institutional racism in our society deepens, the less likely he or she is to resort to explanations that blame the victim. Instead, deepening awareness usually leads to a commitment to unlearn one's racism and marks the emergence of the pseudo-independent stage. Sometimes epitomized by the guilty white liberal persona, the pseudo-independent individual has an intellectual understanding of racism as a system of advantage, but doesn't quite know what to do about it. Self-conscious and guilty about one's own whiteness, the individual often desires to escape it by associating with people of color. Ruth Frankenberg, author of White Woman, Race Matters, The Social Construction of Whiteness, describes the confusing emotions of this process in an autobiographical essay. I viewed my racial privilege as total. I remember months when I was terrified to speak in gatherings that were primarily of color. Since I feared that anything I would say would be marked by my whiteness, my racial privilege, which was in my mind, when her friends of color were making casual conversation, chatting about their mothers, for example, she would worry that anything she might say about her own mother would somehow reveal how her race privilege, and by that time she had sorted it out mentally. The topic of conversation would have changed. She writes, "In that silence, I tried to pass as what? As racially unmarked, as exceptional as the white girl who could hang?" Similarly, white lesbians sometimes find it hard to claim privileged status as whites when they are so targeted by homophobia and heterosection, often at the hands of other whites. These complexities notwithstanding, when white men and women begin to understand that they are viewed as members of a dominant racial group not only by other whites but also by people of color, they are sometimes troubled, even angered, to learn that simply because of their group status they are viewed with suspicion by many people of color. "I'm an individual! View me as an individual!" For example, in a racially mixed group of educators participating in an anti-racist professional development course, a black man commented about using his radar to determine if the group would be a safe place for him. Many of the white people in the room, who believed that their very presence in the chorus was proof of their trustworthiness, were upset by this comment, initially unprepared to acknowledge the invisible legacy of racism that accompanied any and every interaction they had had with people of color. The white people in the course found some comfort in reading Lois Stavley's memoir, The Education of a Wasp, in which she described her own responses to the ways black people tested her trustworthiness. She writes, "I could never resent the tests as some white people have told me they do. But to me, the longest tests have always indicated the deepest hurts. We whites would have to be naive to expect that hundreds of years of humiliation can be forgotten the moment we wish it to be. At times, the most poignant part of the test is that black people have enough trust left to give. Testing implies we might pass the test. It is safer and easier for a black person to turn his back on us. If he does not gamble on our sincerity, he doesn't have to be hurt if he's proved false. Testing shows an optimism I doubt I could duplicate if I were black." Sometimes poorly organized anti-racism workshops or other educational experiences can create a scenario that places participants at risk for getting stuck in their anger. Effectiveness about racism must also point the way toward constructive action. When people don't have the tools for moving forward, they tend to return to what is familiar, often becoming more vigorous in their defense of the racial status quo than they were initially. As we have seen, many white people experience themselves as powerless, even in the face of privilege. But the fact is that we all have a sphere of influence, some domains in which we exercise some level of power and control. The task for each of us, white and of color, is to identify that our own sphere of influence is, however large or small, and to consider how it might be used to interrupt the cycle of racism. Defining a positive white identity. As a white person's understanding of the complexity of institutional racism in our society deepens, the less likely he or she is able to resort to explanations that blame the victim. Instead, deepening awareness usually leads to a commitment to unlearn one's racism and marks the emergence of the pseudo-independent stage. Sometimes epitomized by the guilty white liberal persona, the pseudo-independent individual has an intellectual understanding of racism as a system of advantage, but doesn't quite know what to do about it. Self-conscious and guilty about one's whiteness, the individual often desires to escape it by associating with people of color. Ruth Frankenberg, author of White Women, Race Matters, The Social Construction of Whiteness, describes the confusing emotions of this process in an autobiographical essay. I viewed my racial privilege as total. I remember months when I was terrified to speak in gatherings that were primarily of colors, since I feared that anything I did say would be marked by my whiteness, my racial privilege, which in my mind meant the same. When her friends of color were making casual conversation, chatting about their mothers, for example, she would worry that anything she might say about her own mother would somehow reveal her race privilege, and by the time she had sorted it out mentally, the topic of conversation would have changed. She writes, "In that silence I tried to pass, as what? As racially unmarked, as exceptional, as the one white girl who could hang?" Similarly, a student of mine writes, "One of the major and probably most difficult steps in identity development is obtaining or finding the consciousness of what it means to be white. I definitely remember many a time that I wished I was not white, ashamed of what I and others have done to other racial groups in the world. I wanted to pretend I was black, live with them, celebrate their culture, and deny my whiteness completely. Basically, I wanted to escape the responsibility that came with identifying myself as white." How successful these efforts to escape whiteness via people of color will be depends in part of the racial identity development of the people of color involved. Remember the black students at the cafeteria table? If they are in the encounter or immersion stages, they are not likely to be interested in cultivating white friendships. If a white person reaches out to a black person and is rebuffed, it may cause the white person to retreat into a blame the victim thinking. However, even if these efforts to build interracial relationships are successful, the white individual must eventually confront the reality of his or her own whiteness. We all must be able to embrace who we are in terms of our racial and cultural heritage, not in terms of assumed superiority or inferiority, but as an integral part of our daily experience in which we can take pride. But as we see in these examples, for many white people who at this stage have come to understand the everyday reality of racism, whiteness is still experienced as the source of shame rather than as a source of pride. Recognizing the need to find a more positive self-definition is a hallmark of the next phase of white racial identity development, the immersion stage. Bob, a white male student in my racism class, clearly articulated this need. "I'm finding that this idea of white identity is more important than I thought. Yet, white identity seems very hard to pinhole. I seem to have an idea and feel myself understanding what I need to do and why, and then something presents itself that throws me into mass confusion. I feel I need some resources that will help me through this process of finding white identity." The resource Bob needs most at this point are not people of color, but other whites who are further along in the process and can help show him the way. It is at just this point that white individuals intensify their efforts to see their whiteness in a positive light. Just as Cross describes the period of black redefinition as a time for black people to seek new ways of thinking about blackness, ways that take them beyond the role of victim, white people must seek new ways of thinking about whiteness, ways that take them beyond the role of victimizer. The search for white allies and the restoration of hope. In fact, another role does exist. There is a history of white protest against racism, a history of whites who have resisted the role of the oppressor and who have been allies to people of color. Unfortunately, these whites are often invisible to us. While the names of active racists are easily recalled, past and present, Klan leaders and Southern segregationists, for example, the names of white allies are often unknown. I have had the experience of addressing roomfuls of classroom teachers who have been unable to name even one white person who had worked against racism without some prompting from me. If they can't do it, it's unlikely that their students can't either. Those who have studied or lived through the civil rights era, many of my students have not, may know the names of Viola Liuzzo, James Reeb, or Michael Schwerner, all of these white civil rights workers who were killed for their anti-racist efforts. But most people won't be martyrs. There is a need to know about white allies who spoke up, who worked for social change, who resisted racism and lived to tell about it. How did these white allies break free from the confines of the racist socialization they surely experienced to claim this identity for themselves? These are the voices that many white people at this stage in the process are hungry to hear. Biographies of or autobiographies by white individuals who have been engaged in anti-racist activities can be very helpful. For example, there is a Season of Justice, the autobiography of Morris Dees, the executive director of the Southern Poverty Law Center and a vigorous anti-Klan litigator. There is Outside the Magic Circle, the oral history of Virginia Foster Duer, a Southern belle turned civil rights activist. And there is The Education of a Wasp, a story of Lois Stavely, a mother struggling to create a non-racist environment for her children. Such books can be an antidote to the feelings of isolation and loneliness that white people often feel at this point. There is comfort in knowing that others have traveled the terrain. One of the consequences of racism in our society is that those who oppose racism are often marginalized, and as a result, their stories are not readily accessed. Yet having access to these stories makes a difference to those whites who are looking for ways to be agents of change. White people who are doing this work need to make their stories known to serve as guides for others. In my class, I try to address the lack of knowledge of white role models by providing concrete examples of such people. In addition to assigning reading material, my strategy has been to invite a local white anti-racist activist, Andrea Ayavezayan, to my class to speak about her own personal journey toward an awareness of racism and her development as a white ally. Students typically ask questions that reflect their fears about social isolation at this phase of development. Did you lose friends when you started to speak up? My boyfriend makes a lot of racist comments. What can I do? What do you say to your father at Thanksgiving when he tells those jokes? These are not just questions of late adolescence. The mature white teachers I work with ask me the same things. My white students, who often comment about how depressing it is to study racism, typically say that the opportunity to talk with this ally gave them renewed hope. Through her example, they see that the role of the ally is not to help victims of racism, but to speak up against the systems of oppression and to challenge other whites to do the same. One point that Andrea emphasizes in her speaking and writing is the idea that allies need allies, others who will support their efforts to swim against the tide of cultural and institutional racism. This point was especially helpful for one young woman who had been struggling with feelings of isolation. She wrote, "About being an ally, a positive role model. It enhanced my positive feelings about the difference each individual can make. I don't need to feel helpless when there's so much I can do. I still can see how easily things can back up and start getting depressing. But I can also see how it is possible to keep going strong and powerful." One of the most important points she made was the necessity of a support group system, people to remind me what I have done, why I should keep going, of why I'm making a difference, why I shouldn't feel helpless. I think our class started to help me with those issues as soon as I started to let it. And now I found similar supports in friends and family. They're out there. It's just finding and establishing them. It is really a necessity. Without support, it would be too easy to give up, burn out, become helpless again. In any endeavor, support is important. And when the forces against you are so prevalent and deep-rooted as racism is in this society, it is the only way to keep moving forward. Participation in white consciousness-raising groups organized specifically for the purpose of examining one's own racism are another way to keep moving forward. At Mount Holyoke College, such a group, White Women Against Racism, was formed following the 1992 acquittal of the Los Angeles police officers involved in beating of Rodney King. There are similar groups with different beatings of Rodney King. That doesn't make any sense. Let me say that again. There are similar groups with different names operating formally and informally in local communities around the country. Support groups of this nature help to combat the social isolation that anti-racist whites often experience and provide places to forge new identities. I am sometimes asked why such groups need to be made up of whites only. To many whites, it seems inconceivable that there would be any value in participating in an all-white discussion of racism. While of course there is value in cross-racial dialogue, all white support groups serve a unique function, particularly when whites are trying to work through their feelings of guilt and shame. Separate groups give whites, the people, the space to speak with honesty and candor, rarely possible in racially mixed groups. Even when whites feel comfortable sharing these feelings with people of color, frankly, people of color don't necessarily want to hear about it. The following comment, written by a black woman in my class, illustrates this dilemma. Many times in class I feel uncomfortable when white students use the term black, because even they aren't aware of it, they say it with all or at least a lot of negative connotations they've been taught that goes along with black. Sometimes it just causes a stinging feeling inside me. Sometimes I get real tired of hearing white people talk about the conditions of black people. I think it's important for them to talk about, but I still don't like always being around when they do. I always get tired of hearing them talk about how hard it is for them, though I understand it, and most times I'm very willing to listen and be open, but sometimes I can't. Right now, I can't. Though a white person may need to describe the racist things a parent or spouse has said or done, to tell the story to a person of color may reopen the person's wounds. Listening to those stories and problem-solving about them is a job that white people can do for each other. It is at this stage of redefining whiteness, immersion, that the feelings of guilt and shame start to fade. Reflecting on her own white identity development, sociologist Becky Thompson chronicles this process. I understood that I didn't have to recreate the wheel in my own life. I began to actively seek writing by white women who have historically stood up against racism. Ellie Bulkin, Lillian Smith, Sarah Evans, Angelina Grimke, Ruth Frankenberg, Helen Yosef, Melanie K. Kantrovitz, Tilly Olson, Minnie Bruce Pratt, Ruth Said, Mab Segrest, and others. She also realized that she needed anti-racist white people in her daily life with whom she could share stories and whom she could trust to give her honest feedback. Her experience in a white anti-racist group helped her to stop feeling bad because she was white. She writes, I started seeing ways to channel my energies without having to leave a piece of my identity behind. The last stage, autonomy, represents the culmination of the white racial development process. At this point, a person incorporates the newly defined view of whiteness as a part of a personal identity. The positive feelings associated with this redefinition energize the person's efforts to confront racism and oppression in daily life. Clayton Aldifer, a white man with many years of personal and professional experience, describes the thinking that characterizes this stage. We have a more complete awareness of ourselves and of others to the degree that we neither negate the uniqueness of each person, regardless of that person's group's membership, nor deny the ever-present effects of group memberships for each individual. While autonomy might be described as racial self-actualization, racial identity development never really ends. The person at this level is continually open to new information and new ways of thinking about racial and cultural variables. Helms describes each of the 6 stages as representing patterns of thinking that predominate at particular points of development. But even when active anti-racist thinking predominates, there may still be particular situations that trigger old modes of responding. Whites, like people of color, continue to be works in process. A major benefit of this racial identity development process is increased effectiveness in multiracial settings. The white person who has worked through his or her own racial identity process has a deep understanding of racism and an appreciation and respect for the identity struggles of people of color. When we see strong, mutually respectful relationships between people of color and whites, we are usually looking at the tangible results of both people's identity processes. If we want to promote positive cross-group relations, we need to help young white people engage in the kind of dialogue that precipitates this kind of identity development, just as we need to help youth of color achieve an empowered sense of racial and ethnic identity. Though the process of examining their racial identity can be uncomfortable and even frightening for whites, those who persist in the struggle are rewarded with an increasingly multiracial and multicultural existence. In our still quite segregated society, this borderland is unfamiliar to many whites and may be hard to envision. Becky Thompson has experienced it, and she writes, "We need to talk about what living in this borderland feels like, how we get there, what sustains us, and how we benefit from it. For me, this place of existence is tremendously exciting, invigorating, and life-affirming. Though it can be complicated and lonely, it is also liberating, opening doors to new communities, creating possibilities for more authentic connections with people of color, and in the process, strengthening the coalitions necessary for genuine social change." Chapter 7. White Identity and Affirmation Action. Affirmative action is what I really meant. I'm in favor of affirmative action except when it comes to my jobs. Because of the persistence of residential segregation and the school segregation that often accompanies it, the workplace is one of the few places that the lives of people of color and whites regularly intersect. Those intersections can sometimes lead to close friendships and serve as a catalyst for whites to begin to examine their own racial identities. But even when the workplace is only a site of superficial exchanges across color lines, the presence of an affirmative action policy can be enough to draw an individual's attention to his own whiteness. What will affirmative action mean in my life? Will I get a job I want, or will it go to some minority? Will the opportunities I expected still be there for me, or will I be the victim of reverse racism? Even those whites who have not given much thought to their racial identity have thought about affirmative action. As sociologist Howard Winant writes, "Assaults on affirmative action policies are currently at hysterical levels. These attacks are clearly designed to effect ideological shifts, rather than to shift resources in any meaningful way. They represent whiteness as a disadvantage, something which has few precedents in the U.S. racial history." Though there is almost no empirical evidence for this imaginary white disadvantage, the idea has achieved widespread popular credence. In my classes and workshops, the concern about white disadvantage takes the form of questions about affirmative action and reverse discrimination. Inevitably, someone has a story to tell about a friend or a relative who was not admitted to the school of her choice, or a parent who lost a coveted promotion because the less qualified person of color took that spot. It is interesting to note that the less qualified person in the story is always a person of color, usually black, never a white woman. When these stories are told, I often wonder how the speaker knows so much about the person of color's resume. Whenever possible, I defer the discussion of affirmative action, at least until a basic understanding of racism as a system of advantage has been established. I do this because it is very difficult to have a useful discussion about affirmative action with a person who does not understand the concept of white privilege. If someone uses the phrases affirmative action and reverse racism in the same sentence, it is usually a sign that a lesson on white privilege is needed. This is not to say that everyone who understands white privilege supports affirmative action policies, but at least that basic understanding assures that all parties in the conversation recognize that there are systematic social inequities operating in our society, and that the playing field is not level. We may have different opinions about how to fix those inequities, but an acknowledgement of the inequities is essential to a productive conversation. After assigning several readings on the topic of affirmative action, I asked my students to write essays about whether they think it is a good idea and why. If they are opposed to affirmative action, I asked them to propose an alternative approach to dismantling the system of advantage in the arenas of education and employment opportunity. Several years ago, one white woman wrote the following sentence in her essay: "I am in favor of affirmative action except when it comes to my jobs." I wrote in response, "Which jobs have your name on them?" The sense of entitlement conveyed in the statement was striking. Of course, she wanted to get the job she applied for and did not want to lose out to anyone, especially on the basis of race, a factor over which she had no control. Yet she seemed to assume that because she wanted them, they belonged to her. She assumed that she would, of course, be qualified for the job and would therefore be entitled to it. What was she assuming about the candidates of color? She did not seem to take into account the possibility that one of them might be just as qualified or more qualified than she was. The idea that she was, as a white woman, might herself be the recipient of affirmative action was apparently not part of her thinking. While she expressed a desire for equity and justice, she also wanted to maintain her own advantage. She was still sifting through some confused thinking on this issue. She is not alone. What is affirmative action? There has been much public debate about affirmative action since its inception, with little attempt to clarify concepts. Politicians interchangeably use the terms affirmative action and quotas, have contributed to the confusion, perhaps intentionally. The term quota has a repugnant history of discrimination and exclusion. For example, earlier in the 20th century, quotas were used to limit how many Jews would be admitted to prestigious institutions of higher learning. But despite common public perceptions, most affirmative action programs do not involve quotas. They may not involve though they may involve goals. The difference between a goal and a quota is an important one. Quotas, defined here as fixed numerical allocations, are illegal unless court-ordered as a temporary remedy for a well-documented, proven pattern of racially motivated discrimination. Unlike a quota, goals are voluntary, legal, and may be exceeded. Goals are not a ceiling meant to limit, as quotas did in the past. Instead, goals provide a necessary target toward which to aim. As any long-range planner knows, goals are necessary in order to chart one's course of action and to evaluate one's progress. Goals are an essential component of effective affirmative action programs. The term affirmative action was introduced into our language and legal system by Executive Order 11246, signed by President Lyndon Johnson in 1965. This order obligated federal contractors to take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed and that the employees are treated during employment without regard to their race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. As set forth by this order, contractors were to commit themselves to apply every good faith effort to use procedures that would result in equal employment opportunities for historically disadvantaged groups. The groups targeted for this affirmative action were white women and men and women of color, specifically defined by the federal government as American Indian, Alaskan Natives, Asian or Pacific Islanders, blacks, and Hispanics. In the 1970s, legislation broadened the protected groups to include persons with disabilities and Vietnam veterans. Though Executive Order 11246 required affirmative action, it did not specify exactly what affirmative action programs should look like. Given this lack of specificity, it is not surprising that there is great variety in the way affirmative action programs have been developed and implemented around the country. The executive order has its goal equal employment opportunity. But in practice, because of continuing patterns of discrimination, that goal cannot be reached without positive steps, affirmative actions, to create that equality of opportunity. Consequently, affirmative action can be defined as attempts to make progress toward actual rather than hypothetical equality of opportunity for those groups which are currently underrepresented in significant positions in society by explicitly taking into account the defining characteristics, race, or sex. For example, they have been the basis for discrimination. These attempts can be categorized as either process-oriented or goal-oriented. That was Butch. Process-oriented programs focus on creating a fair application process, assuming that a fair process results in a fair outcome. If a job opening has been advertised widely and anyone who is interested has a chance to apply, and all applicants receive similar treatment, for example, standard interview questions, same evaluation criteria and procedures, the process is presumed to be fair. The search committee can freely choose the best candidate, knowing that no discrimination has taken place. Under such circumstances, the best candidate will sometimes be a person of color, too good to ignore. In theory, such would seem to be the case, and because process-oriented programs seem consistent with the American ideal of the meritocracy, most people support this kind of affirmative action. At the very least, it is an improvement over the old boy network that filled positions before outsiders even had a chance to apply. Goal-oriented affirmative action also provides an open process. However, when the qualified pool of applicants has been identified, those among the pool who move the organization closer to its diversity hiring goals are favored. If the finalist hired was qualified but not the best choice in the eyes of those who don't share the goal, the decision is often criticized as reverse discrimination. Though the process-oriented emphasis is more palatable to some than the goal-oriented emphasis, in practice the process-oriented approach is often quite ineffective. Despite the attempts to ensure a fair process, search committee after search committee finds that the best person is yet another member of the dominant group. What goes wrong? Some answers may be found in the research of social psychologist John DeVito and his colleagues. Aversive racism and affirmative action. In resistance to affirmative action, the implications of aversive racism, John DeVito, Jeffrey Mann, and Samuel Gartner argue that white opposition to affirmative action programs is largely rooted in a subtle but pervasive form of racism they call aversive racism. Aversive racism is defined as an attitudinal adaptation resulting from an assimilation of an egalitarian value system with prejudice and with racist beliefs. In other words, most Americans have internalized the espoused cultural values of fairness and justice for all at the same time that they have been breathing the smog of racial biases and stereotypes pervading the popular culture. The existence both of almost unavoidable racial biases and of the desire to be egalitarian and racially tolerant forms the basis of the ambivalence that aversive racists experience. Pointing to the findings of several impressive research studies, these social psychologists argue that because aversive racists see themselves as non-prejudiced and racially tolerant, they generally do not behave in overly racist ways. When the norms for appropriate, non-discriminatory behavior are clear and ambiguous, they do the right thing, because to behave otherwise would threaten the non-prejudiced self-image they hold. However, DeVito and his friends and colleagues assert that in situations when it is not clear what the right thing is, or if an action can be justified on the basis of some factor other than race, negative feelings toward blacks will surface. In these ambiguous situations, an aversive racist can discriminate against blacks without threatening his racially tolerant self-image. For example, in a study in which white college students were asked to evaluate black and white people on a simple good-bad basis, where choosing bad rather than good to describe blacks might clearly indicate bias. The students consistently rated both blacks and whites positively. However, when the task was changed slightly to rating blacks and whites on a more subtle continuum of goodness, whites were consistently rated better than blacks. For instance, when the rating choice was ambitious, not lazy, blacks were not rated as more lazy than whites, but whites were evaluated as more ambitious than blacks. Repeated findings of this nature led these researchers to conclude that a subtle but important bias was operating. In the eyes of the aversive racists, blacks are not worse, but whites are better. How might such a bias affecting hiring decisions? Would this kind of bias affect how the competence of black and white candidates might be evaluated? To explore this question, a study was conducted in which white college students were asked to rate college applicants who, on the basis of transcript information, were strongly qualified, moderately qualified, or weakly qualified. In some cases, the applicant was identified as black, in other cases as white. When the applicant was weakly qualified, there was no discrimination between black and white applicants. Both were rejected. When the application had moderate qualifications, whites were evaluated slightly better than blacks, but not significantly so. However, when the applicants had strong qualifications, there was a significant difference between how strong white candidates and strong black candidates were rated. Though the information that had been provided about the candidates was identical, the black applicants were evaluated significantly less positively than the white applicants. The subtle bias that Davidio and his colleagues have identified does not occur at all levels, but occurs when you might least expect it, when the black candidate is highly qualified. In this and other similar studies, blacks could be seen as good, but whites with the same credentials were consistently rated as better. The bias was even more apparent when the black person being rated was in a position of superior to the white evaluator. While high-ability white supervisors were accepted by subordinate white raters as being somewhat more intelligent than themselves, white evaluators consistently described high-ability black supervisors as significantly less intelligent than themselves. So even when the black supervisor is more competent than the white subordinate, the white again sees the situation as though a black person less qualified than themselves is being given preferential treatment. The researchers speculate that the bias is accentuated in this scenario because the possibility of being subordinate to a black person threatens deeply held, though perhaps unconscious, notions of white superiority. Social psychologists Susan Clayton and Sandra Tangri also discuss this illusory nature of objective evaluation and offer another reason that the pattern of underestimating the abilities of competent black candidates is so widespread. They suggest that when an evaluator expects a weak performance and sees a strong one, a strong performance is attributed to unstable causes such as luck or effort. Unlike innate ability, luck or effort can change and they are therefore unreliable. However, strong performances based on ability will probably be repeated. Strong performances attributed to ability, the explanation likely used for white male candidates, are viewed more positively and more often rewarded than performances assumed to be based on luck or unusual effort. Davidio and colleagues conclude, the aversive racism framework has important and direct implications for the implementation of affirmative action type policies. Affirmative action has often been interpreted as, when all things are equal, take the minority person. Our research suggests that even when things are equal, they may not be perceived as equal, particularly when the minority person is well qualified and the situation has personal relevance to the non-minority person. Because whites tend to misperceive the competence of blacks relative to themselves, resistance to affirmative action may appear quite legitimate to the protesters. Insufficient competence, not race, becomes the rationale justifying the resistance. The particular irony is that the more competent the black person is, the more likely this bias is to occur. The research that has been discussed here has been framed in terms of black-white relationships. Of course, affirmative action programs may also involve other people of color as well as white women. Yet the black-white emphasis is the aversive racism framework seems well placed when we consider that researchers have found that negative attitudes towards affirmative action are expressed most strongly when blacks are identified as the target beneficiaries. As Audrey Murrell and her colleagues point out, whereas giving preference based on non-merit factors is perceived as unfair, giving such preference to blacks is perceived as more unfair. Now we can see why affirmative action efforts focusing on the process rather than the outcome are likely to be ineffective. There are too many opportunities for evaluator bias to manifest itself. In the initial recruitment and screening of applicants, in the interview process, and ultimately in the final selection. Competent candidates of color are likely to be weeded out along the way. Those that make it to the final selection process may in fact be too good to ignore, but the research suggests, and I've seen it in some of my own search committee experiences, for black candidates to be too good to ignore can mean too good to hire. Not a prejudiced bone in their bodies. A case example. During the first 9 years of my teaching career, I taught on 2 different campuses. In each case, I was the only black female faculty member throughout my tenure. Though both institutions identified themselves as equal employment opportunity affirmative action employers, my experience on search committees in those settings taught me a lot about why there weren't more black women or many black men on campus. Black applicants, too good to be ignored, regularly were ignored. Sometimes because they were too good. Can't hire him, he's too good, he won't stay. She's good, but not exactly what we had in mind. He gave a brilliant talk, but there's just something about him. I can't quite put my finger on it. In at least one instance, I thought I could put my finger on it, and I did. When I raised questions about racial bias, I was told by the chair of search committee, I have known all of these people for years. There's not a prejudiced bone in their bodies. If you've read Chapter 1, you know how I feel about that comment. In this particular instance, I replied, I don't think anyone on the committee would intentionally discriminate, but I know that people feel most comfortable with people like themselves, with the kind of people they've grown up around, and that they play golf with. When interacting with someone who doesn't fit that description, there may be a kind of uneasiness that is hard to articulate. So when I sit in a committee meeting, and white people agree that a black candidate is well qualified for the position, better than the competing white candidates, in fact, but then they say things like, I'm not sure he's the right person for the job. I'm not sure what kind of colleague he'd be. I just don't feel comfortable with him. I think we have a problem. We did have a problem. In this case, rather than offer the black candidate the position, it was declared a failed search, and the position was advertised again the following year. I was not asked to serve on the next search committee, and perhaps not surprisingly, there were no black candidates in the pool of finalists the second time around. Did the black candidates recognize the discrimination that I believe occurred, or was it just seen as another rejected application? I don't know, but this case highlighted for me one of the reasons that affirmative action is still needed. As social psychologist Faye Crosby writes, affirmative action is needed to lessen bias in the paid labor force because affirmative action is the only legal remedy in the United States for discrimination that does not require the victims or someone with a stake in their welfare to notice their condition and come forward with a grievance on their own behalf. In affirmative action, designated individuals monitor the operations of institutions and so can notice and correct injustices in the absence of any complaint. This monitoring role is crucial because an accumulation of studies have shown that it's very difficult to detect discrimination on a case-by-case basis, even when the case involves the self. When we examine the aggregate data, case after case, hiring decision after hiring decision, the idiosyncrasies of particular cases recede and the discriminatory pattern can emerge. Then we can make a change. Keeping our eyes on the prize. Goal-oriented affirmative action.